Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Sydney Opera House. My name's Edwina Throsby, and I'm the head of Talks and Ideas here, and I'm really happy that you have all come today to the Antidote Festival on the first day of spring. And it felt like the first day of spring today, I think. I feel like after a pretty grim few days, the weather today actually reminded me that the world is, in fact, a beautiful place and a place that's worth fighting for. So for those who've been here all day, you would have heard from a lot of fighters, a lot of people who are working all over the world, risking their life and their liberty on a daily basis to try and make this place a better, more just and safer place for all of us. Because we humans have an astonishing capacity for self-destruction. It goes way beyond just drinking too much after work our capacity for self-destruction, I think, is unchallenged by any other species. But what I think Antidote does is suggest that we humans also have the power to find the antidote. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed at the almighty colossal balls up that we seem to be making of this planet and this world, I think that the fact that we humans are clever and resourceful and resilient, and when we come together and we identify what we want to do, we are powerful. I think that that makes us all think that we're not all strapped into a one-way hell-bound train, inexorably hurtling towards doom, despair, and planetary destruction after all. So yay. We're facing some pretty big challenges as a global community, and I would say that probably two of the biggest, if not the two biggest, that we're facing at the moment are climate change and our online world. But climate change, I think, is a little different because more or less, and there are a couple of people who are digging in, but they can play over in the same corner of the sandpit as the anti-vaxxers and all of them. They can stay there. I think most of us, scientists, thinking people, have formed some sort of consensus around climate change. We broadly understand it. We broadly know why it's happened, what its threat is, and what we need to do to save it. I think probably what we don't understand is how urgent it is and how we need to get onto it right now. But I think the online environment's a bit different because I just don't think we know what we're doing. I don't think we have any idea. We have created what's called a virtual world. It's a literal world. We all live it. We all work online. We all move around online. We all live our lives online. We have created a system that has enormous social and political and economic power, and we have absolutely no idea how it works, how to control it, how to legislate around it in a global context. All we do is willingly feed it all of our personal data so we can watch kittens play for free. But I think there are a few people who, because they've thought about it, because they've worked in the area, because they've researched it and studied it, actually do have a few things to tell us about this online environment that we've created and can help us understand a little bit better not only what's going on, but what we might all do to stop the sorts of things that we've already seen politically and commercially and stuff over the last couple of years, amplifying and getting bigger. And two of those people are with us today. And I'm incredibly pleased to be introducing to the Antidote Festival tonight Andrei Soldatov, who is a Moscow-based investigative journalist. His most recent book, which was co-written with Irina Borogan, who's also a guest at the festival and spoke on this stage earlier today, is called The Red Web. And it's a brilliant attempt to try and bring some facts and some proper research to the extraordinarily complex and contested relationship between Russia and the internet. And Chris Wylie who's a social researcher and a data analyst, who shot to our global consciousness a few years ago when he revealed what had really been going on with his former employer, Cambridge Analytica, and how that company deliberately and knowingly manipulated the results of two of the most biggest elections of our recent times, the election of President Trump in the United States and the referendum that brought about Brexit, and we're all seeing how well that's turning out. Hosting this conversation tonight is the excellent Lenore Taylor, who is our local hero. She is the editor of The Guardian here in Australia. The Guardian, along with our other media, Herald and our other media platforms, is doing really good work in this area. So Lenore Taylor's going to be hosting this, and it would be fantastic if you could join me in please welcoming Chris and Andrei and Lenore to the stage. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Chris, and welcome, Andrei. I know for sure, because we've just been having a discussion in the green room, that this is going to be an excellent conversation. Because Chris and Andrei approach this topic from quite different perspectives, I'm going to start our discussion with a brief conversation with each of them in turn. I mention this so you don't think I'm being hideously rude to Andrei when I start asking a couple of questions to Chris in succession. Then we're going to have a discussion, and then for the final 20 minutes tonight, I'm going to be taking questions from the floor. There's 4 microphones, so just before then I'll give a bit of a warning, and if you can come, if you've got a question that you want to ask to either of our panellists, you can come forward at that point. So, Chris, it's not quite a year and a half, I think, since you blew the whistle on Cambridge Analytica to our Sunday sister paper, The Observer and the New York Times, revealing how that company was using improperly accessed Facebook profiles from, I think it turned out to be 87 million people, to target advertising, political advertising, but to do a whole lot more than that. And I think in the ensuing time, Cambridge Analytica has become a bit of a code word, like all things bad on the web. But I think it's important that we start by actually just rewinding a bit and understanding what it was that you revealed then and what the importance of it was.
Sure. So when I first joined what later became Cambridge Analytica, that didn't exist yet. So I joined a British military contractor called SCL Group. My predecessor died in Kenya, and they were looking for a new research director, one who had more experience with data modeling and what ended up becoming profiling. The purpose of the research that we were doing originally was intended for Western militaries to use. Historically, Western militaries have not invested much in information operations or cyber operations because you have generals who like things that blow up, so they're boys with toys, and they think of military R&D as missiles, but you can't shoot a missile at the internet. And when you look at where, for example, ISIS, which was an emerging threat at the time, where it was recruiting, when you look at sort of a lot of non-state actors who were posing real security threats to the United States or the UK, they were online.
So they were trying to target recruiting.
They were recruiting people and disseminating, whether it was hate propaganda or anti-Western propaganda like you get in Eastern Europe. And so what we ended up working on was methods of profiling and identifying who is likely to be a target of that information, who is likely to be a target for recruiters, and also means of, frankly, manipulating people's behavior for security reasons. So to give you a tangible example, counter-narcotics operations in South America often involved, actually in the old days, actually sending people in situ to go and meet people around your target. Often they were high-value targets, some guy running a narcotics operation, whether it was a mistress or a family member or whatever, to start profiling that person and then feeding them information so that they would act on it and make a mistake that you could then exploit. When Facebook and other social media platforms came about, it was a real boon for like intelligence agencies and security agencies, because all of a sudden, your target's mistress and his other mistress and his mom and his whomever, they were all online. And all of a sudden, you didn't have to actually go and invest months and months and months. You could actually go and start to disseminate information at those people. In order to identify, who was your prime target and how you should frame that information, that's where profiling came in. And so oftentimes, you would first target the lowest hanging fruit, which were people who were more narcissistic or more neurotic, because if you are, higher in those kinds of traits, you're more prone to, paranoid or conspiratorial ideation. You would interfere in the operations and functioning of that kind of organization.
So they flipped that into politics.
And then there was an introduction to Steve Bannon. One of our clients met people who worked for Steve Bannon on a plane. My old boss, Alexander Nix, got an introduction. Originally, they wanted, Steve at the time was the editor of Breitbart, which is a very right-wing, website. And Andrew Breitbart, who founded it before he died, had this vision for Breitbart, and he would always say that politics exists downstream from culture. So if you want to change politics, you first attack culture, because politics will just flow from that. But Breitbart became quite niche, and it became sort of a glorified hate blog for straight white dudes who can't get laid. And no, actually, look up incels. I'm literally not kidding. And it was not making the impact that Breitbart had envisioned. And when Steve Bannon found out that there were contractors who were willing to potentially work with him on using the same kinds of manipulative techniques that the military would use to undermine organizations in other parts of the world, all of a sudden it kind of clicked, wait, but what if we did this in the United States? Problem was that we were working on military contracts. You can't just easily, it would be noticed if you just kind of acquired that, outright. So Cambridge Analytica got set up as effectively a front for SCL Group. And very quickly, the work that we were looking at originally for defensive purposes got flipped. And so people, would be identified online through profiling algorithms, and this is where the data was used and helpful to profile people. When you think about all of the things that you put online, you literally reveal who you are. And those people would be pulled into an informational environment. And the people who were targeted in the United States at the first instance were usually the same kinds of people that you would target in other places, people who were more prone to conspiratorial thinking, paranoid ideation, more neurotic, more narcissist, because these are the low-hanging fruit. And they would be invited to groups or pages or forums, and when they joined those forums, all of a sudden, they would start getting messages. Oh, hey, have you seen this? Check out this link. They start chatting with people who may or may not have been real. And when some of these groups, particularly localized groups from different counties in the United States, would get to a certain sort of threshold, a couple thousand even, if only sort of 10% of people actually showed up to an event, you could get a couple hundred people crammed into a room. And so events would be set up, people would come, and all of a sudden, this sort of digital fantasy that people had been sort of playing with or dabbling with, all of a sudden they would come to a coffee shop, and you put 50 people in, it's not a lot of people, but you put 50 people in a coffee shop and it seems like everyone's there. And
so you're not just targeting ads, you're actually creating an alternative political reality.
The alt-right is an insurgency. And so if you're going to build an insurgency, this is how you do it, right? You have to put people together. The same kinds of techniques that you would use to undermine a narcotics operation, right? You start small, tiny little groups of pockets all throughout the organization so they don't get noticed. And they start building relationships with one another. And once they have strong relationships with each other, you then start to pool them together. And at some point, you get a critical mass and it becomes an organic thing. And that's what happened in the United States. And a lot of the people that they ended up targeting were didn't realize that that's what was happening to them. I don't necessarily blame them. I think they were victimized in a way. But when I started looking at what they were doing, particularly with some of the race realism narratives and experiments that they were doing, when you'd get people into panels and you'd ask them questions like, imagine an America where you can't pronounce anyone's name, and starting to get people to go down a path, or pulling people's photos of relatives and pairing them with a picture of a black man and saying, would you feel comfortable with this? And if they say yes, then prompting them and saying, do you feel like you have to say that? Really starting to push people down a path of thinking. And when I saw that, I was just, this is not what I signed up for. But the problem is when you have a billionaire that goes and essentially buys out a company, you can't really complain to HR about,
Yeah.
what's happening.
They crossed a lot of other lines too, though, right? Like Cambridge Analytica crossed a lot of other lines too. I saw in the Channel 4 sting, Alexander Nix, the CEO, suggest to the undercover reporter that the firm could hypothetically create sex scandals or foreign spies.
It was a full-service propaganda firm. I mean, it was end-to-end. You name it, it would probably do it. And it was not unusual to employ hackers. It was not unusual to set up politicians with prostitutes or fake scenarios where it looked like they're being bribed. The firm would do a lot of things. Some of it would be for military clients. Some of it would be for private clients who wanted to capitalize on the resources of generally the global south. One of the things that I kind of learned about how SCL and then later CA operated was that colonialism still very much exists. It just exists in a new form. It's more discrete and it's more digital, but you would get the same kinds of players from Britain or America going into countries that are resource rich that they used to run, and instead of just administering it with a colonial administrator, they would just undermine the democracy of that country so that they could continue to exploit resources.
So after all the inquiries that were set up as a result of your whistleblowing and all the outrage and all the discussion, do you think in the last year and a half, things have changed in a concrete way? Has Facebook changed? Have regulations changed? Obviously, awareness has changed, and that's not an insignificant thing. But in concrete terms, what's changed?
I mean, I guess, Facebook received the largest fine that a technology company has ever received, $5 billion US, plus another 100 million from the SEC. Share value went up because what investors realized was that the tech sector, that governments really don't know how to rein in the tech sector. And if the fine for something as blatantly wrong as Cambridge Analytica is $5 billion, which is a small portion of their annual profit, well, you can get away with pretty much anything. So weirdly, by revealing that their shares increased later on, I mean, it resulted initially in the largest share drop in corporate history in a single day, but they recovered. And are they going to change? Well, they didn't really feel the pain enough. And I sort of look at the history of unregulated industries, and they typically need to go really wrong before things happen. You look at medicine, you have the thalidomide crisis that happened, where you had to have really terrible births and huge numbers of disabled babies in order to establish that actually pharmaceutical companies should prove that what they're creating is safe. And I don't know if we've reached that point yet. And I don't know what it will take for regulators to really start taking robust action and going, what, the internet affects so many aspects of our lives. It's not just, Russian interference and all that. It's like your mental health, how much sleep you get, like your well-being, economic productivity, right? And if we regulate every other sector for safety, why do we not have regulations for consumer safety when it comes to technology? Just because it's software doesn't mean it doesn't affect us.
But to date, not a lot of concrete change.
I have had lots of conversations with members of Congress, members of Parliament, the EU. I haven't seen anything that really inspires me yet, frankly. But I think it's partly because we are still stuck in the language that Silicon Valley uses. We still think of it as services rather than architectures. We still talk about terms and conditions of consent, but
we'll get
anyway,
to that.
I ramble on.
No, you haven't. It's very interesting. Andrei, in the books you've co-authored with Irina, you look at how the internet's been this amazing tool for those in Russia who are challenging the authorities, and also this incredible tool for the state to maintain power, to crush dissent. I wanted to get us to start by getting a kind of picture of how the Russian authorities think about the internet, how they've used control of information to suppress internal dissent, how good they are at it, and whether it is actually mass surveillance in the way that Chris has been talking about it, or whether it's still something different in Russia.
Well, let me start with the Russian idea of the internet and the threats posed by the internet is to much extent defined by the feeling of insecurity and paranoia, because there are some crucial questions Vladimir Putin never found a real answer. For instance, why the Soviet Union collapsed. And he got this feeling, as many of his colleagues from the KGB, that, look, you have a very strange situation. You have the most powerful, most intelligent security service in the world, and all of a sudden just collapsed. And the KGB didn't help to save the Soviet communist regime. So they came up with the idea that probably it had something to do with control of information. And the 1990s, especially the wars in Chechnya, they gave them some ideas about how it could be done by the West. And when Putin started the Second Chechen War in 1999, he immediately found an explanation to everybody, especially for the Russian people, why the first war was lost. And that's true, the Russian army lost the first Chechen War, and why he should win. And he said that actually it was because information circulated completely independently, and he blamed journalists. He said, we lost the war because of journalists, because of the media. Back then, he didn't think of the internet, fortunately for everybody. And he almost immediately, already in 2000, he introduced a very strange idea of information security. He said that we need to control content online. And back then, it was mostly about media, television, and print media. And as a journalist, we all understood it very quickly. But thanks God, for many years, almost for 10 years, he didn't believe in the idea of the internet. And the internet business developed very successfully, very independently from the government, because Putin was not a big user of the internet for many, many years. But still, he had his security services with a very totalitarian ideas about how to control information. But we were not given enough funding. We were not technically very sophisticated. At the same time, simultaneously, we got the private sector. We got lots of companies, lots of IT companies, really good IT companies. And the interesting thing that Russia produced very quickly really great IT sector. Not only IT companies, but hackers. One of the reasons of this is that the Soviet Union back then enjoyed the biggest community of engineers. And we got so many engineers for one reason, because the Soviet Union had one of the biggest military-industrial complex. And to solve the needs of the military, you need a lot of engineers. So Stalin actually established a lot of technical schools and produced thousands of engineers. And they were really good at technology. But they lacked one thing, any ethical standards. They were taught to... That's true. They were never given any ethical courses. They were just given a very basic, narrow idea that you need to be a servant of the state to produce more technology, and that was it. What happened next is that around 2011, 2012, Putin faced the biggest political challenge to his regime. We got protests on Moscow streets, thousands, and actually one day it was about 100,000 people on streets protesting against him, and he got scared because that was the year of the Arab Spring. So he came up with the idea that he probably misplaced the threat. It was not anymore television or foreign journalists. Probably it was social media developed by the West to undermine his regime. And he wanted to find a way how to put social media under control. His problem was that the FSB, the Russian security services, were not really good at it. So he asked it and got help from the private sector. And we had what we are seeing right now is we have this cooperation between private Russian IT sector and Russian government. And as a result, we got very extensive and very updated system of surveillance. We got a very good system of, not very good, but quite good and very brutal system of internet filtering. We got lots of trolls, lots of technologies which helps trolls to spread their message. So far, I would say that inside the country is not extremely successful because the internet was designed to spread information or disinformation, not to contain information. And in the country, Putin is mostly interested in containing information. But of course, he got means and tools to spread disinformation, and he used it to great effect, first in Ukraine, then in the United States and in Europe.
Yeah. I think he would like the big tech platforms to put all their servers into Russia because there's I know the Russian security has a backdoor into pretty much all the telecommunications and internet traffic in Russia. So what would be the impact for Russian citizens if the tech companies did put their servers there?
Yeah, he got this idea in 2014 when we got Snowden in Russia. And some Russian officials, they came up with a brilliant idea to exploit Snowden revelations, saying, look, because Snowden exposed the Western espionage on social networks, we need to protect personal data of Russian citizens, forcing Facebook and Google and Twitter to move their servers with Russian data, Russian citizens' data, into Russia, under pretext of protecting Russian citizens' data. And some people accepted this idea, but in Russia, but not many. And in fact, we get an online campaign asking Facebook not to move their service to Russia, and lots of people signed on. And so far, these global tech companies, they resist and have been resistant for almost 4 years. But if they decide to comply, what we got, we have a legislation that complies and requires everybody in Russia, telecommunication companies, service providers, including social media, to provide backdoors for the Russian security services, completely unchecked. The idea is just to establish a special equipment to lay a cable to the local offices of the security services, to give them the key and lock the door, literally. It's usually, it happens in a big, large room. If you work for internet service provider, you are required to provide all equipment, to pay for everything, and then to lock the door and give the key to the FSB.
And walk away.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so then we get to the US presidential election. We know now that at the same time as Cambridge Analytica was working to spread falsehoods, Russian hackers, a couple of groups of them, I think you say in your book, breached the servers of the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, stole emails which were made public via WikiLeaks. We know Russia had troll factories, people paid to create and disseminate divisive ads. What I'm not clear about is what the aim was. Do you think that Vladimir Putin wanted to get Trump elected? Was that his aim, or was it something a bit more confused? Because it sort of backfired, really. Trump did get elected, but the whole revelation backfired on Russia, didn't it?
Yeah, to be honest, it ends really bad for the Kremlin. And when you describe people you profiled with conspiratorial thinking, I was struck that you described some people in the Kremlin. So these guys, they believe in some conspiracy theories. They believe in the deep state. It's not only propaganda. They really believe that everything about the US election was predetermined by the establishment. So nobody in the Kremlin actually believed they could elect Trump. But what we wanted to do, we wanted to harm and hurt Hillary Clinton, because she was seen as Secretary of State Secretary back in the time of 2011-2012 protests as a kind of mastermind of the protest in Moscow. And a very significant thing happened in the spring of 2016. We got Panama Papers published. And for some strange reasons, the Russian intelligence agencies reported to the Kremlin that the whole operation of Panama Papers, they called it an operation, was inspired by Hillary Clinton. Why? I have no idea why they decided that. And Putin, because his personal friend was attacked, this infamous cellist, who happens to be so rich that everybody get it, that probably he's in charge of Putin's money. And he was pissed off personally, and he wanted to strike back.
So it was revenge?
Yes, it was very emotional for him, and he wanted to strike back, and no matter what. So they just decided to use all information they quietly collected all 2015 and part of 2016 and used against Clinton.
So, Chris, if we stick with the sort of the narrow casting of the debate around the subverting of elections for now, do you see ways that could be fixed, regulated? Do you see ways that we could sort of reclaim regulatory power over democracy and stop this kind of behaviour?
Yeah, I think that just to add to what you were saying, one of the sort of interesting things about Russian troll factories is you actually had Cambridge Analytica personnel in St. Petersburg, and they were working on Russian state-funded research on profiling troll behavior online, and in fact did presentations in Russia about it. So it wasn't just internal. There was all kinds of things happening all over the place related to that. To your question, I think one of the things that to begin with would be really helpful is for legislators and people more generally to think about the internet differently. So we often, if you look at the language that Silicon Valley uses, they talk about data as like this thing, like data exhaust or digital breadcrumbs, as if it's like this waste product that they're just cleaning up, right? Or, the people that they profile are users, not used, they're users, right? Or they're creating like communities or ecosystems rather than surveillance networks, right? So first of all, I think the most important word that I would like to banish, right, is service. Because if you look at the job titles in Silicon Valley, right, the top job titles in Silicon Valley are not, like customer relations specialist, or, service design manager, right? It's engineer and architect, right? And what the internet is, and what social media is an architecture. And when we start thinking about it as an architecture, and we look at how we treat and regulate architectures and products of engineering in other sectors, all of a sudden the defenses and narratives that Silicon Valley produces seem like bullshit, right? So if you imagine somebody who's built a building that's like a maze, right, and doesn't have any exits, and it tries to make you like go through the maze in a particular way, and you can't leave and you don't know where you are. But the guy goes, oh, but I've put a small novella's worth of terms and conditions outside, and when you walk in, the door says that you accept this book. And by the way, the door locks after you've entered, and we won't show you how to leave, and we won't show you what we're doing, and there's no fire exits, and if the building lights on fire, well, you agreed to the terms and conditions outside, right? It'd be like bullshit, right? And so when we look at products of engineering, airplanes, with the exception of the, Supermax, whatever, that was actually because they didn't follow the inspections procedures. But if you look at, planes, cars, if you look at drugs, which is a product of chemical engineering, you look at food safety standards, we put consumer safety first. We use the precautionary principle, and we require industries to prove before going into market that what they've created is safe for people to use. And there is no amount of terms and conditions that you can sign when you get on an airplane or buy a car or go to the grocery store about safety, right? And about how things are used, right? You have statutory rights. And but for some reason, when it comes to the internet or when it comes to software, which mediates every aspect of our lives, there are effectively no rules. And so I think that really, if we did a couple things, first of all, I think we need to start looking at what are design standards, and do we need a building code for the internet? A. B. There's a lot of talk or focus about companies like Facebook or Google or whatever, but companies are made up of people. And so when you look at civil engineers, or you look at electrical engineers, whatever kind of engineer, or an architect, they have professional conduct standards. They have to follow a code of conduct, they have to prove that they're competent, and they have to give due consideration to the people who are using their products. And if they don't, they can be banished from their profession. And so I think, secondly, actually putting skin in the game for engineers who build these things, and to say, you have to give due consideration to the people who are using these things, and if you don't, you can't practice as an engineer.
But we didn't do this. We didn't put in that code of conduct, and now we're looking at whether it can be retrofitted. And in the case of Cambridge Analytica, we still don't know what data they collected.
Facebook does. Facebook knows a lot of things, and because they don't have to, they just don't release a lot of information.
Exactly. So we're trying to retrofit regulation.
Yes, but the difference is that it is, you look at the narrative of Silicon Valley about how they constantly talk about self-disruption, change, move fast and break things. In this case, they broke democracy, but move fast and break things. Well, if they can move fast and break things, surely they should be able to move fast and fix things. And if they can't, then that narrative is bullshit, right? But I think that there are a lot of smart people in Facebook or in Google or in Amazon, or you name it, all these big companies. There's a lot of smart people who, if they were told to prioritize safety, then they would. But there has to be some kind of legal mechanism to force companies to do it. And there's a lot of different things. When you look at the auto industry, and in the United States, why seatbelts became a mandatory thing, and airbags and all this kind of stuff. The auto industry ages ago were going, no, this is going to scare people. It's not needed. Consumer choice. They can opt into it if they want to. It's going to slow innovation. It's cumbersome rules. And it was only until insurance companies who were tired of paying for mangled bodies of people from car accidents that counter lobbied. And it was, there was, because there was a financial cost to another company, then all of a sudden there was a countermeasure. And so if we, for example, required insurance for data breaches, right? And where we then put a cost on where if your data is breached, you are entitled to a statutory amount of money by virtue of your data being misused. And if all of a sudden the insurance company had to pay for that, they would be in the boardroom right away saying, get your shit together or we're not going to insure you.
What do you think, Andrei? Do you think we can?
I completely agree. I think it's a really good point. The only problem here is that we tend to be focused on Silicon Valley, as we think, because we're mostly talking about Facebook and Google and Twitter and Amazon, so we tend to think that most of these things are produced in the United States, and it's sort of understand how to try, at least, to start thinking how to regulate these things. Unfortunately, we live in a really globalized world, and lots of countries out of the United States produce a lot of IT technologies we use, even in the West. And we did research some years ago about the exports of surveillance technologies to other countries. And to our astonishment, we found out that lots of this stuff is produced not only in the UK or Italy or Israel or the United States, but also in Russia and China. And sometimes it might end up with a really difficult things. For instance, just to give you one example, Mexican government some years ago decided that we need to fight, to take it seriously, to fight the extortion business, when you have people kidnapped on the streets and all that. And they decided, they got some funding from US government, And they started looking for a good company, for a good technology of speaker recognition. Because usually the calls, you got somebody in your family kidnapped, and then you get a call with extortion, with the information that you need to give some money. So we wanted to identify these people by their voices. And they ended up in Russia, and they invited a Russian company to provide the technology. And these guys, they not only provided technology, but they provided the technical expertise how to use it. And just because they have this engineer mindset, they said, look, to make it really work, you need to collect as much data as possible. So ideally, it would be great to collect all voice samples of all Mexican citizens.
The whole of Mexico.
Exactly. So what they came up with the idea that actually, if, for instance, you have a young guy trying to get a driving license, it would be great to force him to give up his voice sample. And that's exactly what happened now. In many states of Mexico now, it's obligatory to give up your voice sample. And when I spoke to these guys, to the Russian guys and this company, like, are you happy how your technology might be used? For instance, you can identify not only people, not only criminals, but journalists and activists. They said, look, it's not our problem. We provide the technology. It's better works in this totalitarian manner, because if you have all the amounts of data, it just, well, the amount of, it's really effective, and we are happy with that. And after that, after this success, we got, this company got a lot of requests from other countries in South America with questionable ideas about internet freedoms and any kind of freedoms. And we know that they started buying these kind of technologies. So how to regulate these companies? How to regulate global market of surveillance and IT technologies?
It's actually how how the U.S. military finds targets in particular regions of, like, for example, Pakistan, as drone targets. Because if you can access samples of voices in a phone network, even if you're using a burner phone, you can be identified really quickly. So if you know that you have a target somewhere in this region, and you start tapping into voice data in that, and you get a match, you then know which burner phone they're using, and you can go and shoot them.
So in a way, though, what we're discussing today is even broader than what we've touched on so far. So Shana Zuboff, in her book Surveillance Capitalism, argues that eventually the data that we all give up every day, all day, and the artificial intelligence devices that we're increasingly buying and bringing into our homes, eventually this will take us down a path where it kind of erodes our ability to make our own decisions. It will sort of eat away at our autonomy. I would like each of you to sort of explain what she means, because I figure there's probably a lot of people in the audience who think, well, to start with, those devices, they're really convenient and good. That's why we're buying them. And if we don't do anything wrong, and if we're careful with our privacy settings, then surely it's not so bad. Can you start, Chris? Like, do you accept her argument? Do you accept her point?
So I think that she makes a very valid point. So if you look at where we're heading, data is valuable because it's who you are. It's a representation of who you are. And if you imagine 5, 10, 20 years down the road where we start integrating AI into all of the devices and in physical environments around us, right? So all of a sudden, you go into your living room and your living room is aware of your presence and thinks about you and reports information back to some company. Or it talks to the refrigerator talks to the TV talks to your toothbrush, that talks to the toilet, that talks to your car, that talks to the road, that talks to your office, right? And then they all have a conversation about you, right? And so if we think about like omnipresent surveillance, but it's not just surveillance where it goes to like a person. We're creating not only like aware or about to or just start a journey of creating aware spaces, but motivated spaces where your living room has an agenda, right? I'm not joking. Like it's where you sit and your behavior.
What's my living room's agenda? So
So to give you, a tangible example that could be just a very mundane example, right? So, imagine, I'll give you, okay, so if you've got facial recognition everywhere, in future land, right? And that gets hooked up to insurance companies, it gets hooked up to security companies, risk assessment companies, right? And let's say you've got a teenager and he goes and does something stupid and he steals something, right? And then, he goes through some judicial process and whatever, he goes to juvie or gets slapped on the wrist, gets fined, whatever. But at that point, the physical space remembers him, right? And remembers his face, and he's now profiled. And so let's say he finishes his 6 months in juvie or whatever, and he comes out, and the city won't let him in anymore because the doors become the doorman, right? And if you're a grocery store and you go, oh, well, my objective AI says that this person's a higher risk of theft, so we're just not gonna let him in. And all of a sudden, you create quite literally structural barriers, right? Where, or how your behavior at one point in your life determines how the world sees you forever. Right? That's what profiling is. There's a fine line between trying to profile you to represent you and that representation then actually creating who you are and how the world sees you. And that's a real problem because that could, if the environment constantly watches you and thinks about you on certain conditions and judgments, and it makes judgments on your behavior and seeks to slowly alter it over time, where it can see you, but you can't see it, and you don't know what is and isn't mediated and what you're seeing and why you're seeing it, that really risks, a loss of agency because you're making decisions on options that have been given to you. Mm. And I really worry for humanity because that situation, we have evolved as a species with a passive environment, right? Nature affects us, but it doesn't affect us in a motivated way, unless you're very religious. It doesn't affect us in a motivated way. But all of a sudden, if we create a built environment around us that is motivated, and it can see us and we can't see it, and it makes judgments and it seeks to change things and punish us or reward us, that sounds like divine. If you think about it, do we end up creating our own master? And if you create a city or a world or a country that thinks about you and knows where you are and always is making judgments about you, and making choices for you, how do you escape that? And what does it mean to be a human in that kind of environment where you live inside of something that's thinking? Mm. And I think that's quite profound. And I think that there's a lot of things that could go wrong with that.
So Zuboff also quotes the chief data scientist of a Silicon Valley company who said, the goal of everything we do is to change people's actual behavior at scale. When people use our app, we can capture their behaviours, identify good and bad behaviours, and develop ways to reward the good and punish the bad. We can test how actionable our cues are for them and how profitable for us. Andrei, that sounds quite a lot like the Chinese social credit system.
I totally agree. I think that's, to be honest, there were so many discussions about what could be done, especially after this scandal with the Russian million and US election on the end of customers, of ordinary people. And there were some ideas about some literacy, internet literacy classes in schools, but we need to educate people how to react to things online. To be honest, I'm very pessimistic. I think we cannot do that because propaganda is designed to use your emotions. So when you have a crisis, like you kind of a catastrophe or the war started, if you send a very emotional message, and we got this a lot during the war between Russia and Ukraine, when we have pictures of ostensibly crucified children, you respond emotionally to that. It's very difficult to restrain yourself. So we are pretty hopeless. And even if you say you teach somebody to completely forget about social media and use them only 20 minutes a day, still they are victims of all kinds of things you describe it, of Internet of Things. You go to the shop, you buy something, and you can't...
the environment. How do you escape it?
Absolutely, you can't escape it. So the only possible ways to try to target people who produce these things. And I am, to be honest, I'm a bit skeptical because in my country provides an example, an extreme example, how it could look when you give engineers unrestricted, unrestrained powers to do things. In the 60s, back in the Soviet Union, there was a famous debate in our society, kind of dispute between physicists and lyrics. The idea was to try to prove who are better for the society. Lyrics, meaning humanities people, or physicists, meaning technical intelligentsia who produce things. And in the Russian Soviet societies, technical guys won, because they explained it to everybody, look, these guys, poets, they know nothing about the order. They know nothing about how to build a bridge. If they would be asked to build a bridge, they would get into a dispute, there would be problems, and they would produce chaos. And we produce an order. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, I had a lot of these conversations with engineers. They, by definition, they were thinking that democracy is a chaos. And if you want to build, from the engineer point of view, if you want to build a safe and an efficient environment, you need to build something based on the idea of order, of lack of any kind of dispute or options, essentially a prison. So you need to do something with that kind of mentality. Of course, I'm giving you a very extreme example of the country with very recent post-totalitarian mindset, but it could serve as a very warning example. So we need to think how to fix the education of people who would join Silicon Valley companies tomorrow, day after tomorrow. Because they should understand where we get these ideas about what constitutes a safe behavior or what constitutes a dangerous and risky behavior, where we get these ideas from.
Yeah. And Chris, do you think it's reasonable to compare the private enterprise surveillance that we see with the Chinese social surveillance?
Yeah, I think that when you look at the way technology companies are sort of evolving, it's the one sector, we talk about tech, right? But it's the one sector that actually sort of pervades all other sectors, right? The way tech works is it goes into sector A, B, C, D, E, and then disrupts it, and then takes it over. And when you've got, a couple companies that can not only profile you and control information around you, but also touch on every sort of aspect of your life, whether it's your HR systems or whether it's your self-driving car or whether it's your grocery store. Literally, Amazon bought Whole Foods. It's literally every aspect of your life all of a sudden touches a tech company. And if when you look at how Facebook, for example, talks about dealing with problems. Mark Zuckerberg suggested that they need now an independent arbitration panel for disputes. Where there's a certain code of principles and that you can appeal. And I'm like, this sounds like a court. You're creating a court system. And at some point, my fear is that if you've got a company that touches so many aspects of the economy and your life, yes, it's in the private sector, but at some point, what's the difference? If it touches every aspect of your life, what is the difference? When it comes to the material and substantive freedoms that you have, just because it's not a state. And what makes it worse, in my view, compared to, if it was in a democratic country, is you have literally no representation, you have no rights, you have no due process. I know this as somebody who's banned from all of these platforms. They could ban me. I blew the whistle, and the first reaction of Facebook is, fuck that guy, ban him, right? And there was emergency debates in the British Parliament about literally the fact that wait a second, you can literally delete someone off of the internet. I learned personally how pervasive Facebook was when my Facebook account got eliminated, and a lot of my life just disappeared off of the internet. And if there is no appeal, there's no due process, you have no rights, that's scary. And I don't see the difference. We point the finger at China and go, oh my God, look at what they're doing. And so we're literally building it here.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question of each of our panellists, and after that it'll be your turn to ask questions. So if you've got a question, it's time to start moving to those 4 microphones in preparation. So this is the Antidote Festival. We're supposed to be looking for sort of at least ideas about how things can get better. Edwina started with, thinking about, looking at how people can take action. So if we were to be asking, agitating, pushing for a reform, a change to start to solve some of the problems we've discussed today, what would it be? Andrei.
It might be a bit boring, but I think that, of course, we can try to split these companies. That's kind of decision everybody has in mind. We had with AT&T, that could, maybe seem like a solution. But to be honest, I think the only potentially possible option is to try to install some public councils within these companies.
Councils?
Councils, right. There are some boards of people. And actually, look, we still have around us people who created the internet. And they probably have the highest authority in terms of how things should be done. They build the environment we live now. They are not really happy with what they've done. And they're here, and they're eager to help. The problem is that some of these companies, like Google and Facebook, they try to play with the idea of hiring an advisor on freedom of expression, these kind of things. But they never give these people any powers inside to look into the data and to look into the way these companies operate. So probably if we can push these companies using the government and global community to create these things, boards or councils, and to give them powers inside these companies.
And they have councils.
Yes, and that could help more probably.
Chris.
So
you're looking at ethical AI in your new job, right? You obviously think it's possible.
I think that, so if we look at what some of the problematic things, if you look at, Google reads your email. If you use Gmail, it reads all of your email. But if you had the postal service opening up the letters and reading everything, your correspondence, that's a crime in most countries, right? The telecoms companies in most countries can't wiretap you without a court order, but yet your instant messaging can be if you use certain platforms. So there are things that, for some reason, because it's called tech, that is manifestly unacceptable in other areas of our lives, they're allowed to do. So I think that if we look at how people engage with the platforms and how necessary and integrated they've become in people's lives, they've taken on a status that is similar, although not exactly the same, but similar to a utility, right? And when you have a water company, when you've got an electrical company, when you've got a telecoms company or the postal service, right? There are certain rules that they have to follow because you've got a natural monopoly, and people depend on the service that you provide, and you have a higher standard of care that you have to take when it comes to your customers. You're still allowed to make money, but telecoms companies make money, but they can't necessarily blackmail you with tape recordings, for example. So I think looking at, is there some kind of digital equivalent status? I mean, there's slight differences between the water company and Facebook, but is there a type of status that we can impart on companies that become so big by the nature of their scale, they're too important to leave as a purely private company? A. B, I think that we really need to look at the profession of software engineering and architecture and ask ourselves, does this profession need to be regulated in the same way that all other engineers are regulated? And does that mean safety standards and codes of conduct, right? And thirdly, I think that we need more international cooperation. The problem with the internet is the same problem that you get with climate change. It's a global thing, and it's something that we're inside of. So we need international cooperation. You're starting to see a little bit of that
And competition regulators.
out of Britain, right? You've got 16 different legislators, the equivalent of the technology committees in different legislators, cooperating on trying to investigate the global tech sector. I think we need more of that. But I don't think that we can, unfortunately, I don't think, for example, Australia is going to come up with the solution, because ultimately you need lots, and that's not to slag off Australia, that's literally just,
it's got to be
that, I'm from Canada, Canada's not going to either. It's just that the nature of being a small or mid-sized country, we've got to band together and create an international regulatory framework.
Thanks very much.